Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Catherine, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I think we're in for a treat. We have a very interesting panel to talk about one of the most important topics facing the global economy today. It's extraordinary to me, we were talking a little bit earlier, it's extraordinary to me to see how rapidly we've moved from a situation where globalization seemed inevitable to where today increasingly it seems impossible. There was a time when we saw the momentum behind taking down barriers and increasing interactions and increasing trade among countries was a priority for all countries around the world. And yet today, as perhaps a majority of the world's population in the course of this year is going to the polls, we're increasingly finding the rise of nationalism. And we're increasingly finding countries turning inward, and instead of taking down barriers, building them between themselves and others. Our international supply chains have come under enormous pressure as a result of COVID, of climate change, and of geopolitics. And we're seeing our international institutions, like the World Trade Organization, increasingly under great stress. What we hope to do over the course of the next 43 minutes and 54 seconds is to have a discussion about the rise of nationalism, what the impact is upon business, upon the global economy, upon countries, and how we should be responding to that. We have a very distinguished panel with me here today who will be able to give a very broad perspective. The first is Nicolás Albertoni, who is the Deputy Foreign Minister for Uruguay. Then Paul Slaby, who's the Managing Director of Canada's Semiconductor Council. And then my friend Jeff Nankivell, who's the President and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Perhaps, Nicolás, first of all, welcome to Canada. I understand this is your first visit.
Yeah, thank you, Perrin. Thank you so much. My first time, and I'm glad to be here in the 30th anniversary of this great conference. Thank you.
We are delighted to have you here. Perhaps what you could do, first of all, you are referred to as the Deputy Foreign Minister, and yet you are a full member of Cabinet.
Yes, we have.
Perhaps you could describe your function and then give us a sense as well as to how the policies of major global economies have influenced the international trade environment, particularly with regard to protectionism from Uruguay's perspective.
Yes, as you said, yes, I'm the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs in Uruguay. Formally, we have the Ministry and the Deputy Minister part of the Cabinet in Uruguay. So that's why that's the role. Also, we don't have a Ministry of Trade, so normally the Foreign Ministry has to be in charge of the trade policy too. That's why we have to deal with all the qualitative side of this crazy world, and also the trade side that we also is part of our role in the Foreign Ministry. Answering your question, I think it's important to give a quick sort of policy diagnosis of what's going on from a Latin American perspective. It's interesting to see that nowadays, normally different indices show that we have 50 and 50 in terms of democracies and autocracies around the world. But if we compare with many decades ago, it's, a positive side. After the Arab Spring and all what we know, the world have changed on that regard. But we know also that we are living and facing high uncertainty, economic uncertainty. That could be measured from many different, in statistics and so on. But also, the difference is right now is that we also have a huge trade interdependence. A good example is that in the 90s, we have only 4 regional trade agreements are under Article 24, that you know very well, the WTO, only 40 agreements. Nowadays, we have 600 agreements. We are more interconnected if we see the figures. At the same time, we know that this context of uncertainty could push the governments to increase protectionism. It's something that we know from the literature, it's something that we know from the data, that democracies in this context we are facing could also be facing this push to protect more. But what happens when we combine interdependence, uncertainty, and more lobby to protect? And here I think is a new thing. We are not considering, and the problem we have right now is not the traditional way of economic nationalism that could be translating in protectionism from a tariff perspective. If we see the figures, tariff indeed has decreased over the world. But the main, I would say, cancer of economic nationalism right now is non-tariff measures. That is something, if we, see the data, we have the traditional way of protectionism that could be anti-dumping and all what we know. But right now, given the creativity of economic nationalism, we have more than 100 new trade measures to protect the economy that go very well beyond a transparent way of protect your economy. So to answer your question, I think this is the main challenge we have right now from a Latin American perspective. Through the conversation we're going to have, I could give more specific data and information from a policy perspective. But this is a first impression to answer your question of how we are facing and the challenge we have, and again, from an emerging region, but also in terms of economic nationalism.
Can I drill down just a bit on that? And can you describe in Uruguay, first of all, but in Latin America more broadly, what about the rise of nationalism and economic nationalism? Are we seeing the same phenomenon there as we're seeing, for example, in Europe this past weekend, or in the United States in the presidential election? Or is Uruguay more internationalist in its orientation?
Maybe the main difference in Latin America right now, and I will talk more from my policy analysis hat, not from a part of the cabinet right now, but we are facing also economic nationalism from the left side perspective. We don't have right movements promoting economic nationalisms. But it's interesting because in the extreme, both sides, the radical left and the radical right, we would say, have seen unity, of the similar perspective of economic nationalism. So what we face in Latin America is this more leftist story of protectionism. Of course, we have another problem. We are, I would say, the most integrated region in the world. We have 33 regional projects, Mercosur, UNASUR, and you name it. But at the same time, we are the region that less intra-trade between ourselves. Almost less than 20% of what we trade between with the rest of the world is to Latin America, which shows that we are not doing a good job in terms of good regional integration. We have a very qualitative integration, very policy-oriented, and I would say sometimes it's good to have a regional integration in terms of policy, maybe 1 or 2 projects, but not 30 of them, very focused on the political side of the story. So this is the main challenges we have right now, that we don't have a regional umbrella to promote trade openness in Latin America.
Fascinating. I remember some years ago being at a session where a person from industry was talking about the regional free trade agreements there were, and how literally at their head office they had a map with strings between countries looking, if I go there, open up a plant here, then I'll be able to get into this market. If I go there, I'll get into another one. But so different from the efforts under the WTO, Jeff, from just a few years ago of trying to take down these barriers globally. Could you talk about it from the perspective of the Asia Pacific Foundation and your experience? What are we seeing taking place here? We're seeing international institutions decline. I don't think anybody expects that the WTO will be able to launch a major initiative anytime soon. And we're seeing the rise of regional, plurilateral agreements, and the rise also of the use of trade as a political weapon in geopolitics. How are you seeing that, and how should Canada respond to it?
Well, thanks, and it's a very timely discussion. I would say first, at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, c'est une fondation qui a été créée par une loi du Parlement canadien en 1984. We're a national, not-for-profit, public institution, separate from government. And it is our mandate precisely is to help Canadians to, in their businesses, in their public institutions, and their organizations, to identify opportunities and to navigate the risks, increase their awareness and understanding of the Indo-Pacific region, as we call it now, and to help to project Canada into the region. Our head office is in Vancouver. We have an office in Toronto, and later this year, we will be opening an office in Singapore with the aim of projecting. So when our analysts and our network of distinguished fellows and research fellows look at these issues, what we are seeing is exactly as the Deputy Minister has described, this proliferation of regional approaches, what in the business they call plurilateral or minilateral approaches to trade, and you know, the good story of that is that it shows there are governments out there who, like Canada, are trying to move the ball forward. They're trying to continue to advance the cause of liberalization. And just like, you know, water that's trying to run downhill, if there a bunch of boulders come in the way, a river becomes many different streams. And I think this is what we're seeing. And so, the river being the WTO and global approach to liberalization, and the streams are this multiplication of different approaches and alliances and regional agreements. So, what does that mean for governments? So, for the government of Canada, the approach has been, and this is under governments of different political parties. We have a tradition of really trying to find where those openings are, to negotiate bilateral free trade agreements where that's the best way forward. So in the Asia Pacific region, we have now a 5-year-old agreement with South Korea, and to pursue more ambitious ventures like the CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership. At the same time as we are trying to advance in the CPTPP, where it's worth remembering Canada is the second largest economy in the CPTPP. We're a player at that table, and that is a very significant and a really very high standard trade agreement. Uruguay is one of the countries that has made a formal application. There are 5 others. Something that Canada will need to do, I think we'll come to this later, but as the chair of the Commission of the governments of the CPTPP this year, is to try to advance the project to expand the CPTPP. But at the same time, Canada is pursuing free trade negotiations with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10 countries in Southeast Asia, as well as bilateral negotiations with Indonesia, the largest economy in Southeast Asia. And it's on pause at the moment, but a long-standing project to negotiate at least a partial free trade agreement with India, which we hope, sometime in the next few years that project can resume. So you have to try to find the ways that you can to navigate. At the same time, you have to support Canadian businesses through efforts to reduce non-tariff barriers. We've published studies on the proliferation of non-tariff barriers, technical barriers to trade, things around plant safety, health safety, product labeling, these kinds of things. This is really, as Nicolás has identified, this is really the cancer at the moment that threatens to overwhelm the trading system, and it makes everything more expensive for consumers and for exporters all over the world.
Jeff, Canada is unique in the G7 in that we have trade agreements with each of the blocs. Here in North America, CPTPP, we have a trade agreement with Europe as well. Other countries don't have that. Are we advantaged by the fragmentation of the global market system, or is it a disadvantage for Canada that we've moved away from the multilateral movement to take down barriers?
Well, I think it's a question really of pursuing the least worst option or the second best solution, as economists like to say. We are all disadvantaged by this trend. Every business person in the room knows how much more expensive it is, and it's only going to get more expensive. And I think Paul will be able to speak to that when it comes to a specific sector. But just navigating, even for Canadians, it's great we have these different trade agreements, but they all have different conditions attached to them. Many of them have side agreements that are part of the trading rules that you have to follow if you're going to participate, benefit from the agreement. So I think it's really far from optimal, but we have to do our best. Government has to support businesses to help them to understand institutions like the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, the Canadian Chamber, have a role to play in helping their stakeholders to navigate by publishing research, by putting out ideas, by bringing thought leadership to the table. It's going to take a big effort, but there's no question doing business is only going to get more expensive in the next few years.
An ominous warning here in that. Paul, let's drill down on the issue of how business sees it. Canada's Semiconductor Council is relatively new. Obviously, you are very much focused on the issue of how we can increase our global market share. From your perspective, in your sector, what's the challenge that we're facing at the present time, and how should that be addressed?
Thank you. Yes, let me start with a quote. Chips are the new oil for the 21st century. That comes from Pat Gelsinger, the current CEO of Intel. Now, to get everybody in this room on the same page, let me just quickly say what semiconductor really means, otherwise referred to as microchips or chips. So these are the basic underpinning elements of hardware that pretty much drives anything in today's economy, whether these are your personal gadgets such as smartphones or cruise missiles or anything. Now, the technology is incredibly complex and highly specialized. How complex? The basic element is a transistor, which today approaches in size about 1 nanometer. What's 1 nanometer? A human hair is 100,000 nanometers. 100,000. That means that in human hair, you could have 100,000 transistors. So think about it, how tiny, how incredibly invisible to human eyes those things are. Now, that sector is fairly obscure to general public. However, in economic terms, it's about approaching this year $624 billion. And by the end of the decade, it's going to reach about $1 trillion. So it's a very significant element of the global economy. Now, of course, from the in terms of current situation globally, we're facing unprecedented transition. In semiconductor sector, that is really undergoing a tremendous recalibration and restructuring. About 90% of total most advanced chips production happens currently in Southeast Asia, and specifically in Taiwan. And we know what's happening in that region. We are moving towards multipolar world, and there is no escaping it. It seems that way. So our big neighbor down south of the border took action on that, and in early 2023, we had significant changes. First of all, there was a Three Amigos meeting in Mexico City, followed by the US CHIPS Act with an injections of $50 billion of public money, followed by close to $400 billion private money in the US, followed by $50 billion from EU, and some countries such as South Korea injecting close to $500 billion into that industry. I don't want to mention how much Canada injected because it was embarrassingly small. We need to catch up in that regard. So what's happening, looking at this sector, which is part of the global changes, we can summarize it in two things, the way I see it. It's the threat and the opportunity. And the threats are pretty obvious. They are geopolitical threats, specifically this tension in Southeast Asia, as I mentioned, but also others. If you think about it, there are environmental threats. Taiwan is a country that undergoes every now and then earthquakes. There are typhoons. When the earthquake hits, they stop production for a day or two so far. It could be far, far worse. Just to illustrate how important that is for all of us, think about what happened during the COVID days, where all of a sudden there was a shortage of chips, which people interested in buying cars or any electronic appliances experienced acutely. This could be far, far worse. Now, what's the opportunity? These were the threats. The opportunity is to basically realign the global supply chains so that we can achieve certain level of resiliency. And that's what's happening currently in the semiconductor sector. There's a huge push led by the US to bring a lot of manufacturing onto this continent. Just US itself is building about 50 semiconductor so-called fabs or foundries. The most advanced facilities cost about $20 billion on average. 3 hours drive from where I live in Ottawa, Micron Technology is building $40 billion plant in Syracuse, New York. There's gotta be a way we in Canada can advantage of that kind of proximity.
Let me pursue that if I can, Paul. You mentioned, first of all, that both from the perspective of economic security and from national security, this is a highly politicized sector. And you point out the cost of setting up a fab facility. We don't have the resources, the deep pockets of the U.S. Treasury or of other countries. Where exactly does Canada fit into all of this? How could we link with that plant in the U.S.? I'm assuming you're not suggesting that we start from the mineral to finish production of the chip in Canada.
No. Of course, we have to be smart about it. And I think the current thinking in the industry is that we should, so there are two ways of looking at it. But first of all, the supply chain is incredibly complex. When the chips gets made, it could be designed, say, here in Montreal. The design files could be sent for verification to, say, Europe, and then it goes to fabrication, say, in Taiwan, which uses equipment provided by US manufacturers or somebody from Germany, and then it sends back for testing to Malaysia, and finally it gets packaged maybe in Bromont, Quebec, and arrives here. That's how highly distributed that supply chain is. Now, to be a player, you don't have to be spending $20, $40 billion. What you want to do is have a critical piece in that supply chain that you control, that you have the expertise and ability to deliver. And so from our Canadian perspective, we're thinking about building on our past strengths, so the areas where we have historically had highly specialized expertise, say, for example, telecommunications and networks, chips as a legacy from Nortel and Bell Northern days, as well as the new coming technologies, so AI chips and quantum chips. A good example of a small country that has critical piece of supply chain that owns a critical piece is actually a country in Netherlands. There's a company called ASML there that probably nobody ever heard of in this audience, which provides the photolithography equipment, which it's the only company that provides a critical piece of equipment that is a must to print those highly advanced circuits. So if we can establish competency and invest in, for example, automotive microchips, as an example for electric vehicle, to support the $40 billion investment of our federal government into that sector and batteries, control systems, we could actually own that part of the supply chain. And I think that's the right approach. That's the kind of strategy that does not require $20, $40 billion investments. These are the investments of the order of a few billion dollars.
So you're suggesting what Canada needs is an industrial strategy for the sector. Do we have one?
No. Until very recently, there was a quarter of a person in the federal government covering semiconductor sector.
Quarter of a person.
A quarter of a person. And that person also covered a few other sectors. So right now, thanks God, we have a much better situation and much more attention given to it. We have a department that is being built up and few people working on that. And our role as the council is to provide the industry expertise to those higher powers in the government on that.
Nicolás, in some ways, South America and certainly Uruguay is in a similar position to Canada. The rules are made elsewhere. The capital is elsewhere. The economy, the global economy is driven from elsewhere. And you were forced, as we are, to adapt to these changes as they take place. How is South America, and specifically Uruguay, doing that? And are there best practices that we could learn from you to adapt to Canada?
We have, first of all, how to deal in a complex region. We are the most unequal region in the world, Latin America, but Uruguay at the same time is the strongest democracy in Latin America and the 14th, 15th democracies around the world. So even you are in a complex context, you can do it well. That's the first sort of highlight I would like to say. Also, we promote ourselves not as a country of destination in terms of trade and all what we are talking about, but a country as an entrance, a platform to Latin America. We have the main port in the South Atlantic, so for sure we have the platform to present ourselves in that way. But that said, I think there are key dynamics we have to at least to show and to share with the rest of the world. First of all, in sustainable development. 97% of our energy system came from renewables. Only a few countries in Europe, I would say, could have these numbers and figures that Uruguay is the only one in Latin America. The second one, and related with that, we were the first country that promote an index bond, a sovereign index bond to environmental goals. So we push ourselves to reach the environmental goals to pay more or less depend on a sovereign bond. So this is a good example of a country saying to itself, but also to the population, we have to take care of the environment. In the context we are talking about, I think this is a very important example coming from Latin America. The second dimension, is food security and food quality. We are a 3.5 million country, but we can produce food for 30 million people. And we try to do that in a very quality way. We have a very good food traceability. And I think we are one of the best one in terms of meat in food traceability. You can go from the specific farm where the meat came from to the plate, in a restaurant. So we have this traceability and we have the software to promote that. And this is an interesting story because although we could not industrialize, in a traditional way, in what we are good, this is very vertical development. We try to promote software and technology to that sector. Also, we are dealing, and I think a good signal is how much trade is impacted by the migration crisis in general. Sometimes in terms of the time you have to implement policies, the migration crisis around the world, but also in Latin America is an issue. And Uruguay, as this country, as Canada, has been a very open country for migration and refugee that, sometimes is connected and not connected with trade, but it's a good example to show. But finally, strong political institutions. It's very difficult to talk about all what we are talking about if we don't have, even as a country, but as a counterpart, when you are negotiating, strong political institution in the other side. So being a strong democracy, defend our and our political institution, believe me, Perrin, is a very big part of the story of success, in a small country, but with a huge, I think, political presence, not in Latin America, but also around the world.
All of what you describe is very applicable to Canada. The three F's, food, fuel, fertilizer.
Absolutely.
Canada has an abundance, critical minerals. But it's also important for us to look at the Canadian brand, that it be green, that it be produced by a democracy, people who have a high standard of human rights and so on. So there certainly are lessons that we can learn from you in terms of how we can perform in Canada.
Absolutely. It's all combined because at the end of the day, you have good migration policies, good labor requirements of the products that you are producing to export. In the end, everything, and even this very qualitative side of the story, as it is human rights, is absolutely connected with trade. Because in the end, is to what extent and to what price you are exporting to the rest of the world. This social dumping that sometimes we see in many countries, and so these different layers of the debate, at the end of the day, is always connected with this kind of sort of economic nationalism we see around the world, because we have to take care of every step before the exporting, part of the story.
Jeff, looking to Canada and its relationships with other countries, you can't be all things to all people. You can't assign the same priority to every country. It's a big world out there. How does Canada and how should Canada be setting priorities on where we want to focus for trade? And what sort of criteria need we look at? To what extent or human rights, which Nicolás was just mentioning. To what extent should that factor in? Or should we be simply looking at where's the most burgeoning economic growth and the greatest opportunities from that perspective?
Yeah, these are excellent points. And I think many of the things that Nicolás described, these are things that are assets for Canada already. And when I look at the Indo-Pacific region, the Canadian brand is very strong in areas like agri-food and clean technologies. Canadians have a reputation for high quality and integrity in our own supply chains. That has to be defended and promoted every day. But we have assets. I think just going for the biggest market in a given year is a high risk strategy, and the risks are getting higher in the current geopolitical environment. So I think, as you've suggested in your question, the answer for Canada strategically is to place the bigger bets in the countries and the economies and the regions where we see long-term stability. And we have actually enthusiastic partners already in Asia in the form of countries like Japan and South Korea who are eager to do more with Canada. We see this, and when we participate, as you and I did in the Team Canada trade mission to Japan last year, there's an appetite to do more with Canada. Let's be frank, in this audience, there's a frustration that that we do not make ourselves easy to deal with. And when it comes to championing the cause of free trade, and I'll say something that is not popular in some parts of the country, and this part of the country is one of those, our commitment to supply management in dairy and poultry, this brings us into trade negotiations with one hand tied behind our back. And of course, there are legitimate public policy reasons to favor one sector of the economy over another. But I'm here to say that has external costs that need to be taken into account. So in trade negotiations, if we protect certain sectors, as we do vigorously in our approach to trade negotiations, that's going to affect the market access that Canadian exporters in the whole rest of the economy are going to be able to get, because if you protect something in these negotiations, something is going to be protected from you. Nobody gives anything away in these trade negotiations. So I think we need to look. It's good every few years to look at your priorities and your objectives and whether the public policies you have in place are fit for purpose to achieve those objectives at a time when we need to make new agreements. But I think when it comes to values, there's another factor, geopolitically, our trade interests, if we're looking for like-minded countries frequently these days, while our interests are very aligned with the United States in so many aspects of our life in the world, there are aspects of trade policy where they are not. And there are examples, for example, in the case of China, where the United States has not hesitated to take advantage of opportunities or to use a kind of coercion to craft specific trade deals that favor American interests, sometimes directly at the expense of Canadians. So we need to be discerning when we look at who we're going to partner with. But in Southeast Asia, you have an area of the world with a large population, a growing middle class. We're going to be opening an office there. Other Canadian organizations and companies are opening there. And you have governments who are pursuing an agenda of trying to craft whatever trade agreements they can with whomever they can. And so I think there's lots of opportunity for us to find these like-minded partners. And these are growing markets where consumers are buying products for the first time in their lives, in the lives of their families. So they're actually very attractive markets for some very high-value Canadian products. So I think there are actually a lot of opportunities out there, but it does also relate to looking at where you have governments that you can work with, where you have political systems with which you are comfortable. They don't have to match ours exactly, but you need a certain degree of comfort, and that will provide the stability for Canadian businesses to be able to take advantage of opportunities in trade and investment.
Jeff, you mentioned the China and the United States and the duality, perhaps, that we see on the part of the U.S., where they increase trade with China, but they also restrict others' ability. Every indication is that as a result of the election taking place in the U.S., we will see a much more aggressive approach taken by the U.S. government vis-a-vis China. Given the fact that we do 3/4 of our business with the United States, if the United States takes the position that you are with us or you are with them, how do we decide?
That question.
Yeah, I think that's a question every government is asking themselves, especially those in this hemisphere, but also in Europe. And I think we will need to have a sophisticated approach. As I've said, we diverge on issues, and that's understood. Also in Washington, countries have their own interests. I think there's another level of sophistication. I hate to harp on this, but there's another level of sophistication that Canadian businesses and the agencies who support them are going to need to have, which is if you are in a sector where your ability to export could be affected by American sanctions, particularly on China, but it can be on other countries as well, some of which we sign up for, like on Russia, we are in lockstep. I'm very happy to say, but that won't always be the case. But there's another element. For instance, Canadians are looking to do more business with the Philippines. The Philippines is in a difficult geopolitical context right now with China over disputed territories in the South China Sea. And if you're investing in, let's say, productive capacity in the Philippines that's aimed at the China market, your investment could be affected by sanctions that China imposes on the Philippines. This is already the case for some products from Taiwan. If you invested, in the pineapple business in Taiwan a couple of years ago, you would have taken a hit because of a boycott by mainland China authorities of some food products coming from Taiwan for political reasons. So it's a very complex environment to navigate. And I think for businesses, you need to have diversified supply chains where you have options, where you'll be able, if it's not okay to source from this supplier in China, you need to have a backup supplier in Thailand or Malaysia or Vietnam. And the same applies when it comes to markets. You're going to need to diversify your markets. That's why we are seeing this interest in Southeast Asia at the moment, in particular. And agri-food and clean tech, I would say, are the two largest sectors of opportunity, and we do see movement in that direction.
Paul, I think you wanted to offer a comment on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add regarding the trade agreements and so on. So in the technology field, and specifically in semiconductors and chips, it's important for us to develop those relationships as well. So how is it handled? In May of last year, we had a trilateral meeting in Washington at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and that sector is basically represented by SIA, Semiconductor Industry Association, which is a large industry representative in the U.S. Now, leading countries in the world, about 7 of them, come together in what's called the World Semiconductor Council. And Canada is not a member of that. So we're developing a relationship with SIA in Washington, and we got a path open to be part of the North American delegation. But we need to be a player, a significant player, to get there and therefore sit at that table.
Paul, there's no sector that's more politicized than semiconductors, because it's so important both for national security and for economic security. It is identified by the Americans as a key priority. Does Canada have any choice but to align itself closely with the United States in this?
Obviously, it's actually an opportunity to align ourselves with the U.S. because everything adds up here when you look at the amount of capital, the geographical proximity, existing links and collaborations, relationships, and so forth. Having said that, I think it is smart to develop alternative relationships and linkages, and specifically in the countries in Asia. such as the ones that are, let's call them friendly, right? They're like South Korea, Japan, and of course, whatever we can do with Taiwan, which is basically also building plants in North America and in Europe. We have talks with the TSMC, which is the largest pure play foundry in the world, but we need some focus on this and put together a campaign to attract that foreign direct investment capital into the country.
Nicolás, coming back to the issue of China, we were having a bit of a chat before the session started, and you were saying that there is not significant Chinese investment in Uruguay. You are increasing your sales with China, but it's not a question of investment. This obviously is an area of growing concern on the part of the Americans who may increasingly, instead of focusing on where is a product made, may focus on what is the ownership of the company that made the product. What is Uruguay's strategy here?
Yes. You know, in the figure that you just mentioned and we're talking about before is that the traditional way that China is approaching Latin America, having, state and public and investment, Uruguay has zero of them. At the same time, China was approaching us to have an FTA. Indeed, we just concluded a pre-factibility study to see, what could be a roadmap to negotiate. And I really like your question about, them or us in terms of the U.S., what could be, depending on what would happen in November in the U.S. But if this is the Western perspective of China or us, let's say from a Western perspective, coming from the U.S. or even from Canada, I would like to say that the country that is in that position has to offer something. Because so many times, you guys, indeed, I'm a step behind you in terms of the relation with the U.S. because I don't have that closeness that you have with the U.S. But I heard from my colleagues from the U.S., these China dynamics, or even from the Europeans. But I would love to conclude with you guys. I would love to have a more dynamic trade relations with the U.S. or even with Europe. But in terms of Mercosur, for example, that is a common market in South America, very imperfect, by the way, we were waiting for 20 years. Indeed, we didn't conclude yet an agreement with Europe. So whatever happened with China and this China narrative coming from the Western need to come with an offer from the Western perspective. If not, it's just talking about China, but what do you have to offer? Coming from Canada, saying that in this context, we would love to conclude and be part of the CPTPP. I think we are a good future member doing our homework to be part of it, because from overnight we could have an FTA with Canada, Uruguay and Canada sharing the same values. I don't like the words and the idea of friendshoring, but at the end of the day, given the complexity we are facing around the world, values will be the main creator of trade families. We know, because if we have another pandemic, the best way to have a call with someone is the country that you share the same values. So how close we are in terms of concluding an agreement, having close relations. And again, Uruguay could be an example of how to deal with that China issue. But at the end of the day, I need to export. I need to export in a good way. 60% of my tariff payment in my export go to China because I don't have an FTA. I would love to have at the same time an FTA with Canada, with the US, but I don't see that dynamic coming from China to Latin America from my Western partners.
We are running short on time, but I want to come back to put a question to each of you with regard to supply chains. We haven't had a chance to really look at that in detail. You've alluded to it. And obviously, as a result of COVID, as a result of climate change, as a result of geopolitics, supply chains are under stress unlike ever before. You mentioned that a reluctance on the issue of friendshoring. I'm not quite sure what friendshoring is. It means different things.
I don't like the word, but many people talk about friendshoring, creating, this shoring and global value chains with friends, that you share the same values, but I don't like it.
But my sense is that when anybody uses the term friendshoring, they mean, I want to be included with whatever agreement you have. I'm your friend. But Paul, you were talking about diversifying. Yep. Before, diversifying supply. We've heard about onshoring, bringing production back into Canada, back into Uruguay. What should the strategy be, both in terms of national strategy by government, but also from the point of view of industry and what they should do to ensure that supply chains are durable and are able to sustain.
I have a very simple answer to that for the semiconductor sector. We need a semiconductor pact with the US. Just like we had Auto Pact in the 60s, which created strength in the Ontario and Quebec economy, we need something like that so that we have those parts, just like automotives flying across the border back and forth, integrated supply chain for chips, which are the oil of the 21st century.
Jeff, what's from your perspective, what should both government and Canadian business be doing in order to shore up our supply chains and ensure that they're sustainable?
Well, I think one really important element is to bring a sophisticated understanding to the nature of investment, and that we should not be shy about assisting Canadian companies who are looking to make investments abroad. Investment tends to grow in two-way flows where you have compatible economies and good partners. And so I think, and we are seeing signs of this in the federal government family of Export Development Canada and Canadian Commercial Corporation and Farm Credit Canada and others, that we need to be not shy about seeing Canadian companies investing in productive capacity as a way of diversifying their supply chains, and we need to bring a sophisticated understanding to supply chains in the sense that, as Paul mentioned, if you can identify your niche in the supply chain to be the supplier of this or that key component, that gets you a seat at the table, and that gets you the high value jobs. And I think there's huge capacity in Canada, the most educated workforce in the world, leadership in a number of very important niche, but very important aspects of high technology, of clean technologies, of energy technologies. And we absolutely can get a seat at the table if we focus and we deliver the message to the rest of the world that these are things that we bring.
So Nicolás, just very quickly, what is Uruguay doing to sustain its supply chains?
We are trying to get it connected to the rest of the world. We are dealing with a region that, once again, is very integrated, but switch to political integration, to more trade integration, and also doing it in a sustainable way. If we want to be part of this global value chain, we have to be sustainable. We have to be the country in Latin America that is not just promoting a port, a platform, but also a sustainable perspective of development.
And Perrin, our green energy grid in Canada is just a huge asset for us, nowhere more so than here in Quebec. And global suppliers, European companies, major conglomerates who are huge producers, they are, year on year, they're going to be looking increasingly to be sourcing materials and finding new technologies from places like Canada that can offer a green supply chain and get us back into areas that we got out of maybe 50 years ago.
Well, thank you all. This is a discussion which could be going on for a long, long time and will be in different fora. Very grateful to each of you. It's been fascinating for me. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in welcoming and thanking our panel?